Hi everyone, my name is Victoria. I am doing this video for EDN 301 for our Module 3. The first question asks about learning styles and how I would make sure that I was catering to all the learning styles in my classroom. I am going to go through this one and talk about things that are kind of specific to my school and my classroom. We are an arts school. So we are expected to teach with a little bit more visual and audio, for sure, definitely with some more drama and theatrics in my classroom than maybe in a normal classroom. It does make it super, super fun. It also makes it very loud all the time, which is super great, but it just kind of depends on the classroom. So I teach 5th grade, and in my class, for visual learners, I use a lot of graphic organizers. I really like graphic organizers because I think that they allow the students to sort data, which is important from a beginning level to an intermediate to a more advanced level, regardless of the concept. They can all sort data, which is really important, especially in my classroom because I have varying levels of students, and we go from reading levels in maybe a 1st grade level all the way up to a 6th grade level. And when we're teaching whole group, you do kind of have to figure out how to make sure that all the students get the instruction. So I use a lot of graphic organizers. I also use a lot of paintings in my classroom. Our arts director actually gave me this idea about teaching reading concepts through painting. For some students, it's a lot easier for them to look at a painting and tell you what the main idea of a painting is than it is for them to read a whole book and then tell you what the main idea is. But building that skill through having them look at paintings and visual representations is really, really good. It's also a really good way to have them pull out details when they're looking at a painting or a piece of art. They can pull details out, and just the other day we were talking about small details in writing, and I put a big mosaic up on my smartboard and I said, what is this made out of? And they all, they said tiny pictures or little paintings or whatever, and then I zoomed in really, really far so that they could see each individual picture and how each individual picture made up the really big mosaic. And the point was that each little picture made up the big picture, and when they're reading their books, they should be looking for small details so that they can better understand and see the big picture. For some students, that analogy really, really worked. Some of them looked really confused, but again, that type of learner, that worked for them. As far as the audio component, I use a lot of songs in my classroom. Again, that's a lot easier because we are an art school, so those kinds of things are not only recommended but expected. So like when I was teaching the 13 colonies last week, we actually they practiced and recorded a song for the 13 colonies. I bet you that about 75% of them will never ever forget the 13 colonies because we sang that song a zillion times. So that really is helpful. I also use songs for multiplication tables, and I used one for branches of government. Last year I used them for the amendments. Lots of social studies concepts with songs. So vocabulary words are also really cool to set to music. So definitely a lot of songs in my classroom. The verbal component for kids that learn through verbal instruction, that one's super easy, especially for teachers. I think that we like to talk a lot, so that is just lecturing. Some students learn that way. I don't think that the vast majority of my students learn that way. I learned that way, so like college was really, really great for me because the professor stood up there and lectured. I took notes, and that was that. But I think a vast majority of my students are more visual, audio, or physical. And physical is the next one. That is how I get to that in my classroom is we act things out all the time. So in science, I was teaching like light beams, and we actually acted out how light travels, and the kids ran around the room, and that's not how light travels in a zigzag. It travels in a straight line. So then we had them all line up again and travel in a straight line. I did the same thing with the solar system, and I had the kids like actually move around the room as if they were different planets. So some of the kids learn better that way, and that's why we act things out. As far as the logical learner, that is something that I use probably most in math, just because you can see the order and the reason and the repetition, and it's the same way every single time. During my guided practice in math, we do very similar problems over and over and over again so that they can practice the concept before we move on to really, really difficult problems. Getting that repetition and that logistical pattern down before we move on. The social learner, those kids benefit the most from group work. My school really, really harps on having the kids in small groups. We're not even really supposed to have them work independently very much. So we do a lot of group work in my classroom. I also have what I call captains, and these are my stronger students that actually like sit with my lower students or students that are struggling with concepts, and they will help them through learning it. I'm a very firm believer in that peers can teach sometimes better than teachers can, because I'm teaching it one way and the child is not understanding. But the way that their peer says it, although the same concept, it like makes a light go off in their head, and now all of a sudden they know how to multiply. So I really, really try to utilize the students that really get concepts to help the struggling learners. And those students change all the time. It's not, one student doesn't understand every single thing. So those captains and those people that help the struggling students do change all the time. And then for the solitary learner, that's where independent work comes from. I don't have a lot of solitary learners. I do have children that work better independently, and I do have one that will ask to work alone. And for that student, I do have independent work as opposed to group work for her. She just does better behaviorally, and she knows that. So sometimes she'll actually ask for independent work. So the students that do learn better by working independently, I do try to facilitate that as much as possible, and I do allow them to work independently when we can. However, I do think that learning to work in a group is important. So many of my students struggle really hard with social skills. Either they're very shy, or they're unkind, or they don't know how to sort through a task. So we do try really hard to have them work in groups as much as we can to facilitate being able to problem solve as a group, get along with others, and learn as a group. The two questions I'm going to answer, the first one is about graphic organizers. As I touched on earlier, I'm a very firm believer in graphic organizers. I really like being able to sort data and sort through information. It makes it a lot easier for me to digest, even as an adult. I know that graphic organizers saved my life in college, and I think that for students to be able at a very young age to take a whole page of information or 2 pages of information and sort it into something very short and something very visual is very, very good for them. Not only does it help them to pull out the important parts of the information, but it also allows them to see it in a much smaller, more compact format than all those words on one page. So you have the visual component of it being a graphic organizer, possibly the social component of it being done in group work or in a more than one person at a time setting. You could do it as a solitary assignment. You definitely could do it as a verbal, more like lecture based for sure. And putting it in a graphic organizer, that action itself makes it logical and organized for that kind of learner. So I do think that graphic organizers kind of run the gamut with learners, and it helps them to organize. And honestly, organization in elementary school is key. They need to be able to kind of compartmentalize things, and especially in writing, So I use graphic organizers constantly in writing and in science too. The other question is computers. It's asking about what considerations need to be taken into, or what we need to take into consideration when using computers in the classroom. I think first and foremost for my kids, I have to take into that they all have different exposure and different skill levels when it comes to computers. Some of them have had them in their homes their whole lives. Some of them have never seen a Chromebook until they get to me. So when I say, get your Chromebook out and log on to Google Classroom, some kids can immediately do that, and some have to be taught one thing at a time. I'm learning that a lot with word processing this year. Some kids really know how to use a word processing program, and some really do not. So I think differing levels of knowledge is something that would have to be taken into consideration. And I also think that whether or not they have a computer at home, a lot of kids, when you do things on Google Classroom, if they have a computer at home, they want to go home and do it. And that's super great for those kids. But then for the kids that don't have a computer at home, they then can feel inadequate, or they can get behind because some of the classes doing things at home and some cannot. I also think that some kids view computers as toys, and that can be really, really tricky. So setting up very clear parameters and guidelines from jump is really important. I have very, very clear expectations with my Chromebooks in my classroom, and I don't have a lot of trouble with it. But I know last year I did not have as clear expectations, and it was a little bit of a mess when we used them. I also think that another consideration would be that some students will use computers as a crutch, especially with word processing programs. So I think having them master skills on paper first is super important, so that they don't end up using, autocorrect and grammatical corrections, punctuation corrections, things like that come with a word processing program as a crutch, because they need to learn how to do that stuff on their own. Couple, I think, positive considerations would be that computers are a point of achievement for some students. They're really good at computers, so if they struggle in other areas, being really good at using the computer and being able to do those lessons would boost confidence, and confidence is key when it comes to teaching students, especially ones that are struggling in certain areas. And then using the computers as a reward. I use my Chromebooks as a reward for my kids all the time. They don't know that they are working, but just the sheer fact that they're doing things on the Chromebook is a reward. So like a lot of my vocabulary lessons I let them do on the Chromebook instead of doing them on paper. And I find that they enjoy them because they're getting to use the computer, and they get them done because they're excited about it. So that is my video, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to your feedback. Thanks so much.